So I don't know my building very well. I've only been here a year. All right, well, it's 10:35. So if everyone's okay with it, I think we can get started. We have 23 on and people can keep popping on and Eric will let them in. So I want to thank Jeff Fleming for being here with us today. I think I can scroll over and there you are. Thank you so much for meeting with us. I know you're very busy. I know that things are different at the museum this year. I know you've had to make a lot of changes and adjustments with COVID. I'm glad we're meeting again via Zoom because I sure have missed the museum a lot. So I'm going to introduce Geoffrey Fleming. He was born and raised on Long Island, New York. He attended Mary Washington College in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where he completed a bachelor's degree in historic preservation with a focus on architectural history and museum studies. While there, he was a recipient of the J. Benford Walford Scholarship in Architecture. In 1997, Fleming was accepted into the prestigious Arts Administration program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. As part of his studies, he wrote an extensive thesis on the history and development of museum stores in the United States. Formerly the director of the Saffold Historical Society in Saffold, New York, Fleming now serves as the executive director of the Huntington Museum of Art in Huntington, West Virginia. In the past, he has served with several regional committees and boards, including as president of the Long Island Museum Association, LIMA, chair of the NYS Documentary Heritage Program Committee for Long Island, editorial board of the head of the Harbor, New York, editorial board of the board member of the Long Island History Journal, LIHJ, and is historian of the village of the head of the Harbor, New York. Today, he serves as a grant reviewer for the Kentucky Arts Council, as an accreditation reviewer for the American Alliance of Museums, AAM, and as an emeritus trustee of the Brecknock Hall Foundation. He is the author of 24 books and catalogs documenting the art and history of America, including A Shared Aesthetic, Artists of Long Island's North Fork, Charles Henry Miller, N.A., Painter of Long Island and Irving Ramsey Wiles, N.A., 1861 to 1948, Portraits and Pictures, 1899 to 1948. He is a recipient also of a 2017 Sanson Foundation grant to support the writing of a monograph on the Bay Shore Long Island paintings of the noted American realist painter and Ashcan School founder William J. Glackens, 1870 to 1938. That's a lot, and we're just proud to have you in Huntington and as the executive director of our museum. And I'm thankful that you're here today, and I'm going to let you, without further ado, Geoffrey Fleming.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you to Eric for making all the technology function as it should. I know it's difficult in these days to do that, so we appreciate him. What I'm going to talk about today are upcoming exhibitions, a few that are coming up shortly into the spring and first half of next year. And then I want to talk about some of the acquisitions we made in 2020, which are pretty interesting. And to start people off, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the museum for those that aren't really familiar with it. We were organized in 1947 through the efforts of Herbert Fitzpatrick, our founder. Fitzpatrick was from Virginia originally, but made his fortune in Huntington as an attorney and eventually became head of the C&O Railroad. And he approached the community in 47 and a group of interested individuals about creating an art museum here. And one of the things he asked is that if the community would raise the money to build a building, he would donate the land and his entire collection of art to the community. And the community rallied and was able to pull this off. And so in 1952, we opened up in our first building, which was then greatly expanded in 1970, basically doubled in size. And then since that time, has had a number of additions, including the Edwards Conservatory, where we have the only tropical, subtropical conservatory in the region, as well as the Dane Gallery and two incredible buildings devoted just to studio practice. And then as well as our nationally accredited trail system. So it's pretty impressive for a small town like Huntington. The museum is the largest art museum in the state of West Virginia. We have the largest collection in the state of West Virginia, numbering nearly 17,000 pieces. And we really have the finest collection of art in the state as well. So I think it's pretty special. So why don't we launch into some of the shows that are coming up. And the first one I want to talk about is African-American artists from our collection. We have been building a collection of African-American art for decades here at the museum, though it's proven very difficult for us because of the way our funding works. But still, even with all of that, we've been able to acquire stellar examples of some of the most famous African-American artists, including Henry Ossawa Tanner. And then two works here, which I want to discuss in a little more depth. So on the left is William Edward Scott's Lead Kindly Light. And you will see it again up in the middle of the screen as the cover of the Crisis magazine, which is the official magazine of the NAACP. And this painting was painted for that cover. And Scott was a native in Indiana, sort of along with Tanner and a few other artists, was one of the first sort of great African-American artists to start to look at African Americans as real people, not in the stereotypical ways that a lot of earlier artists had looked at them. And so the painting at left showing a African American husband and wife with their oxen and cart, basically going on to a new sort of promised land kind of idea, sort of leaving bondage and going on to some place that's going to be better. And it's a very powerful painting. And what's really interesting about it is that there were three important William Edward Scott paintings in Huntington many decades ago, and this was one of them. And we're very lucky to have actually had two of them come to the museum. Another work by Scott that was showing a worker in a landscape, and then this one. And what was funny is the owners of those paintings had originally given the worker painting to the museum, but when that owner passed away, they made an offer to the museum that we could either keep the one we had or we could have this one and give the other one back. And because we knew how famous this painting was, we actually made the swap and took this painting, which was really exciting for us. Not only that it was the cover of the Crisis, but it's actually been borrowed numerous times by other major arts institutions across the country to be shown. And if you saw the documentary on Reconstruction that was on PBS this spring and summer, you saw this painting and the cover of this Crisis featured in that documentary, which was very cool for us. So again, really a neat painting that's in our collection. Now, the more subtle landscape down to the lower right, this is by a contemporary of Scott's named Richard Lonsdale Brown. Both men were born in Indiana, but Richard Lonsdale Brown moved to West Virginia as a baby and was raised here, and then eventually, I think it was Parkersburg first, and then lived a number of years in Charleston. But he was discovered by the New York art world and went up there. And he had actually began his career as a sign painter in West Virginia. And he would travel all over the state painting signs for businesses. And in his spare time did these wonderful sketches and landscape paintings. He was invited up to New York, had a number of shows where this painting, a view of Mount Monadnock in New Hampshire, was shown, and was actually acquired by the famous New York collector Jacob Schiff, and was in his collection there. Brown eventually left New York and followed his parents back to Oklahoma, which we believe is where his mother was from, and died there as a very young man in his 20s. So he's almost forgotten today. But we are very lucky to have this painting in our collection, which is one of his most notable, and was discussed in newspapers and other publications when it was featured and then acquired by Schiff. And he was also an illustrator that worked for the Crisis. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, another cover of the Crisis, which is their Easter April 1912 issue, which features a painting by Brown. So as I said, the museum's very lucky to have these two work by two very important African-American artists who were practicing in the early 20th century. And this show is going to be great because it doesn't cover just early historical works. It goes up to the present day and will include works by Willie Cole and Joyce Scott and Carrie Mae Weems. The latter two both have been honored with MacArthur Genius Awards, which is really an amazing feat. So I encourage you to come up to the museum and see this show when it opens shortly, and it will be up through the spring here at the museum. And do pipe in with questions if you have them, and I'll take more questions at the end. The next show I want to briefly touch on that's going to open up after the new year is a still life show from the museum's collection. And still lifes go all the way back to ancient Rome and Egypt, where they decorated buildings and homes. And they're really all about representing the natural world, whether it's animals and plants, one or the other, or a mix of the two. And this is a favorite of mine that's in the collection. This is Benedict Hess's still life of raspberries from the middle of the 19th century, 1850s probably. And Hess was a German painter who emigrated to America and settled in Pennsylvania and was known for doing still life paintings. But what I love about, still life paintings like this is their exactness, trying to feature things exactly as they are. And even the wonderful whimsy that's thrown in with this painting as we see the caterpillar at lower left, which you don't always see in a still life like this. So that's going to be a fun show. And again, it's going to focus more on 19th century works, though there is a wonderful still life in the collection that goes all the way back to the 17th century that's in our collection. So again, it's going to be a nice display that opens up in the spring and runs through the early part of summer. Our next is a perennial favorite, the Daywood collection. This will be open for the first half of 2021. And the Daywood collection is one of these great treasures in our state. It was actually built by two West Virginians, Ruth and Arthur Dayton. They received their first painting not long after being married and then made a lifelong effort to build a collection of late 19th and early 20th century American art, particularly Impressionist works. And there's three at the bottom of this screen that I'll briefly talk about. Lower left is William Robinson Leigh's The Pursuit, Cayente, Arizona. Leigh was a native of West Virginia, but went out west, settled out there in the teens and 20s, and was very important in the Western schools in depicting the American West. And we're very pleased to have this painting as part of the Daywood collection. In the middle is Robert Onrye's Kathleen. Robert Onrye actually went over and spent a lot of time working in Ireland, where he depicted the children of local farmers and residents. And that's what this portrait is of a young woman and Kathleen. And it's a very special painting to the museum's collection because we knew Kathleen. Kathleen actually lived to be almost 100 years old, and her family has been here numerous times to see this painting. Most recently, her granddaughter came about 2 or 3 years ago to see it in person, having never seen it other than from a print that hangs in the family home. So it's one of those rare instances where we were able to have that personal kind of connection with a subject in one of our paintings. And what's really nice about this is we learned in talking with the family that, Robert Onrye, he would pay these families a modest sum for their children to sit, but it was a sizable sum, in the early days of the new Republic of Ireland, where money was scarce. And so whole families would send their children to be depicted. So there are literally, dozens of cousins and family members that he depicted that are connected. In fact, several of Kathleen's cousins got in on the action because they could make some good money having their children pose for Onrye. So it's a great painting. And it's actually one that's on the road right now out in Indiana on display, because parts of the Daywood collection are going to be traveling for the next 3 years to museums across the United States, which is very cool. The final painting at lower right is Edward Redfield's Road and River. And he's a Pennsylvania Impressionist and is known for this wonderful impasto that he imparts on the canvas. And that's a very special painting and sort of apropos for this time of year. It very much gives you the sense of the deep and heavy snow in Pennsylvania and the person running off in the distance in his sleigh heading toward those houses in the background. Perhaps the most famous painting in the collection that the Daytons acquired was Child Hassom's Lincoln Birthday Flags, 1918, showing a view in Manhattan just after World War I. And Hassom did a series of these paintings that he showed all together in New York with the hope that someone would buy the whole group and display it. And they all had to do with flags and celebrations around the conclusion of World War I. But nobody ever did, and he ended up selling them individually. But this particular work, he retained. He had a special fondness for it, thinking it one of the best examples from that series. And Arthur and Ruth Dayton desperately wanted this painting. And they actually spent 3 years trying to acquire it. They really didn't want to pay all cash for it. They wanted to work out a trade with Hassan, and he was adamant that I don't trade for paintings. That's always been my policy, and I'm not going to do it. But the end of his life was approaching, and finally he decided to agree to a deal, sort of a cash and trade deal. And in fact, he died before they were able to conclude their activities. But Hassam's wife wrote that how happy her husband would be that it's going to go to their collection. And so it's a real treasure to have here in West Virginia at the museum and at our museum. And let me tell you a little bit about how this collection got here, because it's a really strange story. The Daytons lived in Charleston, West Virginia, and after Arthur Dayton died in 1948, Ruth had to figure out what to do with all the art because it was scattered amongst their various residences and on loan to other institutions, including a club in Pittsburgh. And what happened was she couldn't find a location to really house it. She had originally considered Charleston, but she said that, that'll just bring politics in the matter, and this is never going to happen. She wrote actually a wonderful quote about that. So in the end, she decided she would open up a gallery containing the collection in her the sort of summer residence in Lewisburg, West Virginia. And so she acquired a building next door to where she lived, and she renovated it into this new museum. And for about 15 years, she personally oversaw the management of this little gallery where the art was on display. But then in 1960s, 66, around there, she realized she was getting quite old, and she didn't have anybody to take over or protect this collection or keep it here. So she started to look at what options might be out there. And it was at this time that the Huntington Museum of Art reached out and sort of said, wow, it'd be great to have your collection come to Huntington and be part of our collection. Would you give us some money to expand the museum so we could house it? And she said, no way. I spent all of our money building this collection, and I don't feel like I should have to build a building as well if you want it. And the museum understood that. And so they sort of parted ways amicably, but kept, the conversation open. And then a few years later, the museum was awarded a major grant from the Doherty Foundation, which was going to allow the museum to double in size. So we reconnected with Mrs. Dayton and said, what about now? What do you think? And she said, this sounds great. And so they worked out the details. And in later 1966, it was announced that the collection would come to the museum, which was a horrifying news to the people of Charleston because they all thought they were going to get the collection. But it did come here. In fact, even before construction started, the bulk of the collection was already here on site, stored in our vaults. And in 1970, when the museum finally opened, the Daywood collection went on display, and it's been a treasure ever since. So one of the requirements is that we show a large portion of it every year. And so this coming year's iteration will be the first half of the year, where people will be able to come and see works like Hassam's flag painting and many other favorites. The collection actually encompasses about 400 works. So it's quite a large collection. And again, one of our finest. We also show lots of contemporary art. And in doing that, we try to be very careful to select artists who have established either a national or international reputation, or that have participated, at least regionally, in our exhibition 280, which is our big invitational show that we do about every 3 years. And it includes West Virginia and all the states that surround it. And so we meet all sorts of interesting people. And Craig Subler, who is coming up in the new year, is one of these artists. And these are 2 of his works. And he's really known for these eccentric spaces and transformation of spaces that he does his works upon. And he's a neat artist. He's actually from Ohio, Dayton originally. He studied at a number of institutions, including the University of Iowa and at the University of Missouri, the Kansas City Gallery of Art. He's been a lecturer and teacher at a number of institutions, at lots of shows, but he actually retired here to West Virginia and is really known for his print work, which is what we're going to be featuring in the new year. And you can see here on the left a work based on an ice pop and the dripping of that ice pop combined with images of 19th century paintings by Bouguereau. And on the left, this strange sort of surrealist, on the right, I mean, the strange surrealist kind of landscape of a figure seated in the foreground with a road and sort of a gas station mini mart in the background. I mean, he's also done a series which is really interesting, Inside Museums, and how people react to art within museums. So I think this is gonna be a fun show. And as I said, it's a great way to bring contemporary work into the museum, because a lot of our monies that we're allowed to spend annually on acquiring work until recently we were blocked from buying contemporary art. That's just not what our donors who gave the money wanted to fund. So we are constantly trying to bring in works like this. The final show I want to talk about this morning is Denise Roberts' show. And she is a quilter, but she is a quilter who's taken quilting from a craft to an art. She began doing her work in about 1989 and then really raised it to a real artistic level in 2005. And she and her husband also live in West Virginia, but she also used to live in Huntington many years ago. So she has been in our community. She's a teacher, has run numerous workshops, and her quilts are very modern and abstract, and making them very different than traditional quilt making in our region of the country. As you can see in this image, just these beautiful sort of swirling shapes and forms. We're excited to have this because it's going to be just such a bright and colorful show and such a different take on her work. She's one of a couple of quilters who are doing this kind of abstract and modern work in quilting, which is really very different than the traditional manner of doing them. And so we're excited to have this. As I said, we've had a long connection with Denise going back to the 1980s and 90s in Huntington, and now having her as a resident of West Virginia. It's really exciting for us. Now, in terms of acquisitions, I want to talk a little bit about how we do that here at the museum. So we are given an allocation of money every year from a number of trusts that donors left the museum that are specifically crafted only to support the acquisition of artwork for the museum. So every year we get this allotment, and it's restricted to different things. So we have a fund restricted to Asian art. There's a fund restricted to pre-1940 paintings. There are funds restricted to only works on paper. And one of our cool funds, which was left to us by one of our docents, is devoted actually to support contemporary acquisitions. And we only got that gift about a decade or so ago. So we've been using that to really acquire interesting and exceptional contemporary works that we think will sort of stand the test of time. But we also are given lots of art. And every year we get works. These are from people's estates. They're from collectors who want to benefit the museum. They're from members and sometimes random individuals who we don't even really know that well, who reach out to the museum. And one of those I want to talk about is Charles Burkhart, who was a WVU professor who passed away this past year, who ended up being a major collector of Japanese woodblock prints. And he invited us up to his home and had us look at the collection. We said, this is really neat because we don't have a lot of Japanese prints in the collection. And he had formed a collection of about 400, mainly the era 1880 to 1980. So while the image you see here is more typical of what we think of as Japanese woodblock prints, sort of depicting scenes from mythology or historical events in Japan, that's not where his interest lied. He was much more interested in what was happening sort of in the modern era in Japanese printmaking. And so when you look at a work like this, which again, I think is more what we all think of as typical, Charles was more interested in works like these. And these are two woodblock prints from the early 20th century by Hiroshi Yoshida. And you can see this great influence of Western art in how it has transformed the Japanese print from what we just saw. So these are very reminiscent of Art Nouveau works in Western Europe, and not scenes of historical dramas or actors or mythology, but we see views in Japan of daily life and what landscape was like. And so on the left, we see a young woman and her child, who you can see he's trying to pull away from his mother, and she's holding onto his hand, you know, outside of maybe their home, out in their yard, or maybe outside of a temple. And on the right, we see an important historical site, a temple site in Japan, with all the trees and blooming around it. Again, very different from that first print. And that is this influence of sort of Western art after World War I, really, and a little bit earlier into Japan. But then we sort of get the opposite effect after World War II. Here's another beautiful work by Hiroshi Yoshida, again, showing that Art Nouveau look. You're almost feels like you're looking through, if those of you who are familiar, through a Tiffany stained glass window with the wisteria sort of hanging over, framing the view into village life of all these people walking over a bridge in their little community. And if you look again at the far left there with the one little girl holding a flower up as she goes over the bridge. After World War II, here's what we're looking at. We are now seeing the simplicity of Japanese design in their printmaking that is going to come back across the seas in the other direction and influence modernism in the rest of the world. Here we have works by the artist Yuzaburo Kawanishi, and then two works by unknown artists. But you can see how everything has become super simplified in form. If we think about that work we just saw of the bridge, if we look at the far right at this scene of a couple of people sitting by the water, everything is very abstracted. There's no detail. It's outlined. You get just the basis of this tan brown for the heads and a few lines for the outfits. The same in the background for trees and houses. So it's quite a transformation. And that's what makes Charles Burckhardt's gift so interesting, is that it's looking at this transformation and these two major influences and how art is moving, how artistic influence is moving around the world. So really neat. And we're going to have our first show from this collection in about a year or two. We are currently working on all the cataloging because there are 400 prints and it's a lot of material to get organized. But that was a wonderful gift. And only a few weeks after we met Charles, he passed away. And we were alerted that we needed to come up and gather this collection. So it was really special for him to consider giving it here when he could have easily given it maybe to the art museum at WVU. But he chose this collection to go to the largest art museum in the state, in Huntington. So very neat for us. Here's another interesting work that we got the past year. This is a ceramic bowl. It is super paper thin, and it's by Otto and Gertrude Natzler, who were two artists born in Vienna, Austria. They worked there separately, but then they met, and they fled after the Anschluss in 1938 and came to America and became known for these super perfect ceramic forms. And that was something Gertrude was particularly known for, and for actually being one of those first artists where you could really see her fingerprints in the work of the ceramic. Otto is known for inventing over 2,000 different glazes, which he and Gertrude would use on their works, where they would collaborate. And in fact, they made over 25,000 pieces during their lifetimes. And they're very rare, very collected. And we were very pleased that a West Virginia collector who owned this brought it in one day and presented it to the museum this past year. So it's really great because for those of you that know our studio program, we have an amazing clay program. And so we have quite an incredible collection of ceramic and clay works in the collection. And this is another one that sort of fills that niche, somebody we didn't have who is super important. The Natzlers are so important is that their retired kiln, the first one they built in the United States, is at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. So it shows how important they are in the ceramics field. So again, a super important work for our collection. This is a work by Hannes Beckmann titled Luminosity. And for those of you that know right now, we have a very cool show on the Bauhaus up. And Beckmann was a Bauhaus artist. He was born in Stuttgart, Germany, and he studied there from 1928 to 1932 with some of those famous teachers like Paul Klee and Kandinsky and Albers. He went to Vienna to study photography after that, and he actually became the director of the photographic studio in Prague. But then after the Germans came in and occupied Czechoslovakia, he actually joined the resistance and was interred in a concentration camp and was lucky enough to escape death and came to America in 1948. And he was really interested in sort of the variations in color and pattern, and that comes out of that Bauhaus aesthetic. This is an oil painting, and you can see done with tons of lines arranged in a pattern with subtle gradations in the colorations. And this was a very cool piece we acquired this past year to be part of our exhibition. And the show we've up now is not about the creation of the Bauhaus, but rather its impact on America. You know, so many of these artists that fled Germany and other parts of Europe came to America. And when they came here, they brought this aesthetic, the aesthetic of studio education and learning through practice. And they brought that to small and more rural communities in America, and introduced American students to that, who then took that to their students and so forth. And it's really why, you know, we're very lucky in Huntington that we have a building here at the museum designed by the famous Bauhaus architect, Walter Gropius. Who would ever expect in a little town like Huntington that we would have, you know, a major work by him? So it's a really wonderful show, and it's up till the end of January, I believe. So you still have a chance to see it. It's really, really interesting. So another great acquisition for that collection which we've been building here at the museum. I don't think many people realize how eclectic the museum's collection is. And this is just an example of that. We have a really interesting and quality comic art collection at the museum, numbering several hundred pieces. And this is actually a work by Neil Adams, and it's a self-portrait as Batman. And that's really important because Adams, he is one of the great comic book artists who helped design Batman and Green Arrow for DC Comics. And so we have a number of his works in the collection, including this one. He's really important in the comic book world, so much so that he was actually inducted into the Will Eisner Comic Book Hall of Fame in 1998. And so this was a special piece that he did on commission for a collector here in West Virginia, and that collector then gave it to our collection here. And you know, it's really special for us to have a comic book collection, at least I believe so, because of how connected that is to younger generations who might not enjoy or understand finer art. They all love comic books and what they have created on the cultural scene in America, including all the movies that they have that have been based on them. So again, this is an ink drawing, part of that collection. And as I said, there are several hundred works, including a wonderful Peanuts cartoon by Charles M. Schulz. So lots of big names in that collection. And again, getting another piece for it is always exciting. This is a fun one. This is Albert Pell's Go on Strike Coal Miners. And would you be surprised that the Huntington Museum of Art has a collection of art depicting coal mining and those kind of scenes? Not really, considering our historical background here in West Virginia. But we do have a collection, and this is a painting we just bought, and it depicts John L. Lewis, who was a very famous leader of the organized labor movement, and he was the president of the United Mine Workers of America for 40 years, one of its longest serving presidents. And what he was known for was his brutally effective and aggressive fighting for higher wages for his membership, while steamrolling over his opponents, including the United States government. So you can see that Pels has depicted him at center with all sorts of things related to what he's working on. Miners working the coal, the upper left at the top, a strike with police fighting coal miners, the skulls with coal miners' caps representing coal miners who've been lost in accidents, the bargaining table down at lower left with miners on one side and management on the other, and also the tragedy of losing coal miners at the lower right bottom with a casket and a family weeping over the loss of their worker. So, you know, Pels, who was born in Cincinnati, sort of became known for doing things like this as early as the 1930s, where he takes sort of a sculptural approach and treats the figures in a way that they almost look like they're sort of coming out of this two-dimensional work of art. So this is a really cool work to join sort of the paintings and prints and drawings we have that relate to coal mining in the Appalachian region. So again, really neat. And it's also neat that Pels is from our region. He's not from somewhere far away. He's from Cincinnati and studied there before he went to study on with lots of famous American artists, including one of the most famous, Thomas Hart Benton. So anyway, let's move on to the next work. This is very different from the painting we just saw. This is titled The Sentry, and it's by E.M. Harrison. And Eleanor M. Harrison was a native of West Virginia. And it's a recent discovery for us. We had never heard of Harrison before. And there was almost nothing written on her in any of the records. In fact, when we were shown this painting, we got very excited about it because the museum has an important collection of Near Eastern art. So the arts of sort of North Africa and the Middle East. And we thought, wow, this would really fit that collection because of its subject matter. But we knew nothing about the artist. And so we got it here and we sent it off to be conserved and cleaned because it was very dirty. And we started to research her and we said, wow, this is a woman artist and it's somebody we haven't heard from before. You know, what can we find out? And what we found out is she was born in Clarksburg, but she studied with Frank Duveneck at his art school in Cincinnati. And Duveneck is one of the most famous teachers in the middle part of the country. And she was one of a number of women who attended his classes in the late 1880s, early 1890s. And this figure was one that is based on an African-American young man who posed for Duveneck's class in around 1890. And there's actually a photograph of him with all of the women students in the studio who were painting him. And what's interesting about this work is we believe it was exhibited in the major exhibition in 1891 that Duveneck and his students had at the Cincinnati Music Hall, because she's mentioned as being in that show. And she's not mentioned in any other records and being any other of his exhibitions. And so really interesting to find this work and bring it here. And after she came back to West Virginia, she actually went on to study at the Corcoran School of Art in Washington, D.C. And then along with her sister Daisy, spent the majority of her life living in Washington, D.C., where on occasion she would exhibit with the Washington Society of Artists and where she would teach. And I'm told by a family member that when the trust income got a little low, that's when she would start teaching again because she wanted to supplement her income until the next trust check came in. So sort of very funny that, that she didn't do it on a more regular basis. But it's a beautiful study of this figure with wonderful detail in the face and in the hands, especially the figure's left hand. So we're really proud to have this now. It just actually came back to the museum, and we're hoping to hang it soon in our Near Eastern gallery so people can view it in person. Because the other thing that it has, which is pretty amazing, is it has a frame that was carved by one of the artists in Cincinnati, we believe, which is original to the painting, which is not very common and hard to find. So.
Was she an African-American artist?
No, she was not. She was not.
Mhm.
And in fact, none of the women who studied there with Duveneck at the time were African-American. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we get a little further along, because we've got some African-American works we're going to discuss that have come in during this year. So let me move forward and we'll get to that in a few minutes. This is a really neat work, and anybody who's been up to WVU may have seen the finished work for this painting. This is the study for George Gardner Simon's painting, Flowing Outward and Beyond. And it is a view of the campus of WVU. You can see its very famous old main building there at the middle left. And the original painting was commissioned as a mural for what's called Elizabeth Moore Hall up at WVU. And that building was opened in 1928, and it became the campus home for the female members and students at WVU who were first admitted in 1889. And they had never had their own building. And so as sort of a commemoration, they commissioned Simons to do this mural on the wall there, where it can be seen today. And what's really exciting about this, and this goes back to this big competition between Marshall and WVU, Huntington and Morgantown. WVU did not know that this study existed, but we did. And we hunted it down and reached out to the owner and said, could we buy this painting for our collection? And the owner said yes. And so now this study for this famous WVU painting isn't up in Morgantown, everybody. It's here in Huntington, where it's going to stay. So it's a real sort of cool thing for us to have by a very prominent American artist who is also in our collection in the Daywood holdings. He was from Chicago. He studied at the Art Institute of Chicago, then went to Europe, won lots of awards, and was a prominent exhibitor in New York and other big art exhibitions. And he's known for his beautiful sort of impressionistic landscapes, particularly for his winter scenes. And so this is just a very cool painting for us to have here in Huntington as part of our collection. And we're hoping to feature it on our magazine cover this spring, just to let WVU know that we have it. Here's a very different work by a Huntington native. This is a quilt by Teresa Polly Shellcroft called Inspiration Facing East. And it's really amazing that two of the most prominent African-American quilt artists in the country, both from Huntington, West Virginia. So Teresa Polly Shellcroft and Tina Williams Brewer. And this is a work by Shellcroft that we acquired this past year. We've wanted to have a work in our collection for some time, but only we're finally able to pull it off. But both Teresa and Tina have taught here as part of our Master Artist program, which I should talk a little bit about. The Gropius Master Artist program was founded about 20-something years ago here at the museum. And the whole idea was hearkening back to that Bauhaus aesthetic of learning through studio education. And we had a funder, Roxana Booth, and her son Alex, who wanted to design a program based on Walter Gropius's idea of studio education here at the museum, where people could come, no matter who they were or their background, and study with a world-class artist. And over the years, we've had well over 100 visiting artists who are nationally and internationally acclaimed, who have taught at the museum. And Tina and Teresa, whose work is shown here, have been part of that illustrious group. And again, another artist that takes quilting beyond the craft and makes it more of an art form. She is particularly known for a quilt that traveled the country when, as part of the celebration around Barack Obama's inauguration as the first African-American president of the United States. But currently she is out in California, where she teaches at a number of community colleges and does these wonderful quilted works. And so we're just terribly pleased to actually have one of her works now in the museum's collection, especially because there's only a few artists from Huntington that have gone off to have national attention. And Teresa is one of those people, and it's really worth knowing. Another African-American artist we've been searching for a long time for our collection is Sam Gilliam. And he was really, and he's still alive, of course, but he's one of the great innovators of post-war American painting. This is not a painting, this is a print by Gilliam called St. Albans. We are not a wealthy enough institution, unfortunately, to afford a painting by Gilliam, but this is a great example of his print work. And he had a series of breakthroughs back in the middle of the 20th century, particularly in the 60s, with his drape paintings, where he would actually suspend these stretcherless paintings in museums and galleries on displays that sort of just hung off the wall. And that was entirely new and interesting. And so he really expanded upon the tenets of what it meant to be an abstract expressionist artist. And you can really see that in this print, that, you know, while it doesn't represent anything, it does, you can sort of see the imagery of an American flag in this work, if you look hard enough, with the bands of color subtly hinting at that almost. But he is one of the most prominent African-American artists in the country. He's had numerous solo exhibitions, including at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. in 2005, at the Whitney, at the Speed. He's in every major collection in the United States, and including the Museum of Modern Art. And he was one of those people that we were really missing, that we felt was super important for the museum to have in its African-American collection. And as I said, it's a collection we've been building slowly because of some of those restrictions we've talked about in the past, where we didn't have money that was allocated in a way that we could buy these kinds of works in the past. And that gift about a decade ago by one of our docents, the Donald Harper Endowment, was really amazing to allow us to start buying contemporary works. And it was a gift that we never knew was coming. Don was just a devoted docent. And after he passed away, we got a letter saying, basically, you're the benefactor of his estate, and he wants you to do this with it. And those are the kind of people we really need at the museum, because it's the only way that we're ever going to be able to expand our holdings into more modern and contemporary art. Because our biggest funds, like the Wheeler Fund, it's pre-1940 paintings only. That eliminates 80 years of American art that we can't acquire. And so it makes it really hard to bring in works that represent more about what is going on in America now versus what happened in the past. So again, we're just delighted to get this work by Sam Gilliam. Here are two works in our collection by Wolf Kahn. And Kahn was actually one of the first Gropius artists. And at the far left is a pastel called In a Park, Huntington, West Virginia. This is the creek in Ritter Park. And this is from the class that he taught, taking artists down to actually work from nature there along the creek in Huntington. And we're really excited to have that work on our museum collection, because it's not only a master artist who came to Huntington to teach, but it's a view in Huntington. You know, many of the artists we've had don't do works that are about representing the natural world. We have people who come in who do ceramics and who do printmaking, and their work has nothing to do with here. So when we're able to get one that's actually a view of something here in Huntington, that's pretty cool for us. Kahn was born in Stuttgart, Germany, and he came to America not long after war broke out in Europe. He actually studied under the GI Bill because he joined the Navy in America after he got here. Studied in Chicago, got a Fulbright scholarship as well as numerous other scholarships to study. And he sort of became known for this blend of realism and color field work. You know, you get works that do represent a landscape, but not always. If we look at the work at right of a barn, and Kahn became known for his works of barns in New England. And this one is called The Barn in May. It's there, but it almost isn't there. It's somewhat abstracted. It sort of floats in space. Even though he painted in oil, he was really known for his pastel work, particularly. The painting at right, we just got this past year. And this came from the Ashland Oil collection, which is really exciting for us because for many years when Ashland Oil was building their art collection, we were the consultant that helped them form that collection. So these works that are now leaving their collection that we've been able to acquire, and we've been able to acquire, I think, over 2 dozen, are sort of coming home to Huntington, sort of where our curators helped make those decisions back in the day in the 1980s, building their collection. So it's really neat. And we hope to have this painting, which is much larger than his pastel you see at left, out in an exhibition soon. This is a real favorite of mine that's just come in. E.B. Lewis is an African-American illustrator, and you'll see at left a painting titled Sitting on the Porch, which was done for the book cover. You'll see it right, talking about Rosie, which is the book about one of the first African-American female aviators in the United States. And what's sort of funny is E.B. Lewis was, again, part of our Master Artist program many, many years ago. And when he was here, this book had just come out. But at the time, we had no money to buy contemporary works of these artists. Now go forward 15, 20 years, and we finally have the money to do so. We reach out and we find out this is the very last painting from this book available for sale, and we were able to buy it. And so now we have an original work by Lewis, and it's from this book that we featured on the poster at the time that he was a visiting artist here in Huntington. So that's really amazing. And Lewis himself, he had two artist uncles who sort of got him interested. He began sort of studying sort of in the 6th grade. He went to Temple University and the Tyler School of Art, where he decided he liked watercolor, and that painting at left is a watercolor. And he taught in public schools for 12 years and now teaches at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, but he knew he wanted to become an illustrator, really. And his work is now one of the most sought after in the country. And to have a work from one of his famous books in our collection where he taught other regional, aspiring artists is really cool. And over the past several years, we've really added to this collection of works by the Gropius artists that back in the day we weren't able to buy because we didn't have the money that Donald Harper left us. So again, it all ties together. It's really special. And this painting will be out in the African American show, which is coming up, which opens up in about a week, and will be, as I said at the beginning of my talk, will be on display into the spring. So I hope you come and see it. It's not a large work, but it's just a beautiful, subtle work and a great addition to the museum's collection. Another new work that we have recently acquired is this painting by Arthur Singer, West Virginia Cardinals and Dogwood. And what you'll see at the left is the watercolor painting, and at the right is the West Virginia First Day cover, because in 1982, Singer was hired by the Post Service to illustrate an official set of the 50 official state birds and flowers to be issued as stamps. That series became one of the most popular ever issued by the United States Post Office, with over 500 million sheets sold and over 25 billion individual stamps sold. When we saw this coming up at auction, we got terribly excited because we wanted to have West Virginia's stamp painting here in Huntington, and we were able to buy it. So very exciting for us. Singer himself was born in 1917 in New York City to a family of artists. He actually went to Cooper Union in the city, studied advertising, and then he got invited during World War II to exhibit his illustration work for the National Zoological Society, which sort of picked up on him becoming one of the best known illustrators of birds in the United States. And actually, he was the first recipient of the famous St. Gaudens Medal Prize in 1962 for his work. And so just, really exciting to be able to have the original artwork for our first day cover at the post office in 1982. So, as I said, a very recent item, not exhibit. In fact, this painting is in my office. It's still wrapped in the packing material because we haven't taken it out yet. It is so new. So, pretty exciting. The final work I want to show you that we've recently acquired, and I apologize for the picture, but this is literally brand new and it is sitting in my office. I had to pick it up in my car not that long ago. And one of the great holdings of the museum is our folk art and outsider artist collection. It's exceptionally rich and includes works going all the way back to the 19th century and works all the way up to today by artists that didn't have formal trainings, trained by themselves, lived in their communities, and did art for art's sake. And we had a curator here for many years, Ethan Eig, who had an incredible eye. He built relationships with many of these artists, and it's why our folk art / outsider art collection is so incredible at the museum. But this is an artist who, again, we have been chasing for years. Huntington resident, Billy L.A. Scott, an African-American self-taught artist. He was a police officer and a barbershop owner in Huntington, and he got into painting. And we used to host what were called the Black Art Expo exhibitions. And they were opportunities for African-American artists from our region to exhibit at the museum and show their works. And Billy L.A. Scott was a part of those, but we had never been able to acquire work from him. And he passed away in 2015. We were finally able to connect to his family and acquire 2 works of the collection. And this is one of them. And it's unrestored, so it's very dirty, and it doesn't look that great right now because it's literally just arrived. But it's a huge painting. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet, and it's really neat. It shows a view on the Ohio River, and it's a sort of funny view on racism, because what we see in the lower foreground are 2 groups of people. We have African-American figures on the left, and then white figures on the right. And in the foreground is a white figure in a hat with a badge on, so he's a sheriff or a police officer, and he's pointing to a sign that this is the whites only section on the river. What you notice about the painting, though, is the white only section doesn't have a lot of people. It's very darkly painted, very moody, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of fun going on. But if you look on the left-hand side of the river, where the African-American side is, we have a lot of fun going on. We've got an artist painting paintings. We've got a guy with his apron working on the grill. We've got people making food. We've got people preaching. We've got people just enjoying themselves. And so it's a funny take on what is not a fun topic, and just a great addition for our museum. And we really can't wait to get this painting cleaned. It'll brighten up immensely and get it restretched and framed so we can show it at the museum. In the upcoming African-American show, we actually will have a smaller work by Scott on display, which is ready to go. So again, really exciting for us to, when possible, feature artists who lived, worked, or were born in Huntington and achieved a certain standard and quality of artwork that makes them worthy to be up at the Huntington Museum of Art. So that is my discussion of what's going on in upcoming exhibitions and what we've acquired that's really interesting over the past year. I thank you for your attention, and I'm really happy to take questions from anybody who may have them.
Jeff, Bill Wilson, when you restore and when you just said about the cleaning up of acquisitions and so forth, our staff there, I mean, that's done in-house, and we have the people that are learning and expertise and professionals, in your staffing.
That's an excellent question, Bill. No, we don't do that in-house because it's such a specialized field. Well, we will do remounting, framing, that kind of work here in-house. We've got a great staff for that. Anything that needs real careful work, we take to Cincinnati to a conservator, to a conservation studio, whether that be a sculpture, a painting, a frame, and we have them do it because it's really important to be careful when working on paintings and other artworks, because they can easily be damaged during the conservation project process. And so this painting, it's in technically good shape, but the stretcher is broken on it, so it needs a stretcher. And it's also very dirty because it has an older varnish which has gotten drippy and dirty on the surface. So, and it needs to be framed. And so we will take it there and it will get cleaned, it'll get revarnished, which will protect the painted surface. It'll get restretched so it's very stable. You can see how in the upper right corner and the bottom left-hand corner, they're very out of shape. That's because both those corners have broken under the weight of the painting because it's so big. It really needs a more substantial stretcher. And then we will frame it so it can be hung properly and look as it should in a museum setting. And so it's really important for me, especially with all the flack that we get in West Virginia for being West Virginia, that when we show work, we should show it to the best of its ability, to show it as perfect as we possibly can. And so, as I said, I apologize for showing this to you in advance, but I think it's a cool story. It's a neat artwork. It's an important artist for us to have, and it'll look dramatically different when it's shown in the museum.
Well, that helps to appreciate the operations that you're having to deal with in relation to acquisitions and the cost of that. And, you know, and acquisitions is purchasing the whatever piece of art, but it's then getting it ready for public and sharing and
Exactly. And you know, it's sometimes we're very lucky we buy something and it doesn't need anything. It can go right up on the wall. And that's great. But every once in a while, you know, you'll get something that, you know, really needs work. We were given a sculpture, a really important sculpture by a prominent American Jewish artist, Chaim Gross, a couple of years ago that had disappeared. It was very important. It was an early work. It had been done for a major competition, basically to create a monument to a World War II hero. And it was broken in pieces because it was a plaster sculpture that had been stored in somebody's garage for decades. And it needed to go and be truly carefully reassembled. And the dramatic difference in what it was when we got it to what it was when it was finished and we were able to show it, it was remarkable. And that just goes to the craft involved and the artistry involved in the work of conservators who, you know, in that case, saved a piece of art that may have disappeared altogether had it not been for their efforts. So it really is important.
This is Rick Walker. I have a question about the first slide that you showed up with the two couple on the oxen. Is it hard to go back to that?
Yep. Yes.
The picture on the left is not the same that's on the cover. Not only is there I guess behind the lamp here, there seems to be something, but also the clouds are in a very different pattern. Did they take this as a basis for the cover, or did they take the original picture and make some changes to it? And do those changes have symbolic meanings?
Yeah, okay, I'm so glad that somebody caught this because I was thinking about it myself the other day. Okay, so here's what happens. I get commissioned as an artist to create a painting for a magazine illustration. It goes to the magazine's design department and they say, we don't like it. We want you to change it. We want you to do this, that, and the other thing. So you go, okay, well, if I want to be paid, I better make these changes. So the answer to the question is yes, artists will change works, not only based on what perhaps the person commissioning the work wants, but also as they see it in layout. They may themselves say, I don't like the look of how that cloud is sitting. Let me go back and rework that for you. And so it is. The thing that you see near the lamp on the left, that's not actually in the painting. That's a library receipt stamp for when the magazine was received by a collection. Right. Yeah. So that's also a good catch. But yes, and lots of illustrated works will have tons of changes from the original concept art to a actual piece that's printed. And this being a painting, the process is a little different. When you see it, when it's done like a watercolor or drawing, many times what they will do is they will do a cutout and just lay the cutout over the part they want to rework. Whereas in a painting, you really need to sort of rework the surface of the painting to get it to work. So yeah, I mean, really, really good catch and excellent question. We have a lot of illustrations in the museum. I think it'd be sort of fun at some point if we could find them and where they were all illustrated is to look at and do a comparison, have the original work up, and then the image of how it was printed and say, what do you see that's different? What has changed? You know, because it is it's a very different process than just saying, I have created an artwork and that's what it's going to look like, to being someone who's commissioned to do a work and you are told, well, if you don't change it, we're not gonna print it. So, really interesting.
Would you give the artist's name again of that particular?
This is William Edward Scott, who is an
William.
African-American artist, was born in Indiana, and was really one of the sort of first artists to start portraying African-Americans in a way that was more realistic and true to what was going on, rather than the sort of stereotypical views that a lot of white artists utilized in previous times.
And the dating of it again was?
This was made for the 1918 publication, The Crisis.
Right.
So it's probably, it could be either shortly before or it could be 1917 maybe, but it's right around that era.
Thank you.
Yes.
This is Jane McKee. I think I'm muted here.
No, we can hear you.
We hear you.
Okay, good. I wanted to go back for just a minute to the Billy Elliot Scott picture that you showed us that you're getting ready to
Sure,
put on
all the way
display.
back.
And you mentioned that you have a collection of work. When I look at this and I hear you talk about self-taught artists and so forth, I always go back to the idea of Grandma Moses. And I always think of it as that school. Do you have a collection of pictures that are similar to that?
We do, and the folk art outside art collection is not just paintings. There are drawings, there's a lot of sculptures, there's a lot of dioramas, anything you can think of that somebody can come up with, we have. And as I noted, Eason Eig, our former curator, had a real love for self-taught art and really built this collection. And there's a number of works in it where he went out and traveled to the studios of artists in Kentucky and other places and met with these artists and sort of encouraged them and then bought their pieces for the collection. And what's even funnier about that is the only piece in our collection that depicts a member of our staff is a folk art piece, and it is actually a sculpture of Eason with his puppy dog that one of the artists created and that Eason got and then gave to the collection here. So that's how instrumental he was to some of these artists in fostering their work. And it's quite a large collection, our folk art and outside artist collection. And we would like to travel it because we don't put it out all the time. Every few years we show selections from it because it is such a large holding. And it was last up, I feel like 2 or 3 years ago, it was on display. And there was it filled our largest gallery, and it was really an amazing assortment. Again, of works going all the way back to the 1850s, including one of our most important holdings, a portrait bust by Asa Ames, who was working in the 1840s. 2 works like this, this painting was created in 1987 by Billy Scott.
Wonderful. I have a picture by Dixie Fisher from Wyoming County, who was very much that way. If, say, someone wanted to gift a picture to the Huntington Museum, how would that person go about that?
It's fairly easy. You can arrange with our curatorial department to bring it up here, and we'll take it, and then we will bring it before our collections committee, who will review it. And if they decide that it's a good fit for the collection, then we accept it and we do some paperwork and it's all done.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Can you go to the slide right before this one? Okay, so first day issue. My dad worked for the post office and and I have a couple of those. Does that come out with every painting that is that because the post office made a stamp from his painting and then they gave it the first day issue card thing?
Yes, well, it depends. The U.S. Post Office works with artists all over the country to create artwork for their stamp series. And it really depends whether they're just issuing a single stamp or they're doing something like this that was to celebrate all 50 states.
Okay.
And so this was, as I said, was one of the most popular issues of the 20th century. And it's why when we saw the painting coming up at auction, we just felt it was so important to try to get this and bring
Beautiful.
it back here and have it in West Virginia. And
And
maybe I could talk a little bit about that for just a moment. You know, people think we have a large West Virginia collection at the museum, but we don't, because our donors were never interested in West Virginia. They were in, even though many of them were from West Virginia, they were interested in what was going on in national and international art movements. And so until very recently, we didn't have a lot of things that depicted West Virginia or were by tons of West Virginia artists. And so we are building that collection because we are behind. There are lots of places that were doing it much earlier than we were, because our donors were looking at much broader, artistic trends and their impacts across the country. So we are always looking for great West Virginia works. In fact, we acquired 2 works this last year. That was a view of Harper's Ferry, done by a very famous Hudson River School painter called Thomas Doughty. It's actually one of the earliest views of Harper's Ferry. And then we also acquired a painting by West Virginia's only surrealist artist that we never thought we'd get a chance to buy, because he only painted about 14 or 15 paintings during his entire career, and most of them are in major American collections already. So we're constantly working for extremely high quality West Virginia artists, as well as views done in West Virginia. So
Do we have many paintings or artwork by Chuck Ripper?
we have, I believe, 3 by Chuck Ripper.
And any of them are from the postal collection? Did he do a post office collection at
Yeah.
one?
I think one it's one of the Christmas ones. And then there's a lovely one of ice fishing, which we bought in the past couple of years, which was probably an LL Bean cover. We're not quite sure. And then there is a 3rd work, which I don't remember exactly what it is. But Chuck Ripper was one of our master artists who taught here many years ago as part of that program.
Thank you.
so with this painting, you got the first day issue as well?
No, we don't. I just have
don't?
shown you that
Oh,
as an
okay.
example. We probably will end up buying an example of it, because it's not very expensive to buy that first day
No.
cover.
No.
But now that we have the art, we'll want to frame up the cover and put it next to it when we show it. So yeah, eventually we will find one of those and buy it.
That's just a beautiful painting. Beautiful.
With
It
two
really is. It
artists
shows you
here-
why he was so well known for his bird.
Oh,
With 2
Is it-
artists here, do you surmise that one did the birds and one did the plant? I mean, it's Alan and Arthur, or did they just divide it down the half, and one did the right half and one did the left half?
That's another good catch. And yes, father and son did work together. And I don't remember which one did which part. I feel like Arthur did the birds and Alan may have done the fauna in the series, but I can't be quite sure. It's funny, in the particular field of bird illustration, there's a number of those sort of incestuous family relationships where fathers and sons and daughters and wives are all people who work in that vein and sometimes collaborate on projects. So yeah, pretty neat.
it's beautiful. And Dr. Walker, you are on target today. You're just really on it. Pointing out all these details that maybe some of us, I did notice the 2 signatures, so thank you for bringing that up.
Well, the artist in my family is my wife, and she's here but hiding in the background. So we're
Aw.
just so appreciative of this opportunity, and we plan to come to the museum several times. That should be a great thing during COVID, is have COVID trips through the museum. But thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh yes, please do come see us. We're open. You come with your mask and you make an appointment, and there's lots of beautiful things on display.
Thank you,
Oh.
Jeff. I was just going to ask you how we can, how people can still visit the museum.
Yeah, we are open. We're following all the COVID protocols. It's really easy to get free online tickets on Eventbrite. And if you don't know how to do it on your phone or on your home computer, if you come to the front doors of the museum, we can actually help you do it and get it done on our system so you can come in. And we are about to do, as I said, a lot of the stuff that's up now will be closing just after the new year. And then be putting up all of these new shows that'll start coming on board. Right now, the first show to open is going to be the African American show, which opens in about 10 days. And then after that, in late January and February, things will start switching over for some of these other shows that are going to come online. Yeah, there's a lot of nice stuff coming up over the next year. This is just a sampling of what we're going to be having. But again, if you get any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I actually have one question. I'm sorry. This is a little bit of a different direction, but I know that you were discussing earlier how contemporary pieces are difficult for the museum to acquire because of parameters to funding. I've had an increasingly larger number of people start talking to me about digital artwork. Is that something that the museum has of interest? What's your personal perspective of digital artwork at this point in time?
It's not something we've done a lot with, again, because of pricing and art. I feel like we have one or two pieces. We also are very cogent of our audience, and our audience here in West Virginia, and particularly the American South, tends to be more conservative in their likes in art. So we do keep that in mind about what we acquire. That doesn't mean we don't acquire things that are controversial or new age or modern or contemporary, but we do tend to err on more traditional forms of art in terms of what we acquire, again, because of the restrictions of how we can spend money. That said, we are given things all the time that break those boundaries. We were given an incredible drawing by a contemporary artist this past year, which I did not include in my presentation today because it is a very provocative new drawing, which some people don't like, but it's in our collection and we have shown it since we acquired it. There are some people that just don't like those works. So we're always, as I said, cautious, and we tend to lean a little more conservative just because we want to, A, not get into trouble, which who needs that in this day and age, and B, because of our access to funds that are restricted in so many different ways. So I think there's a ton of digital stuff that would be great to do exhibition-wise at the museum. But again, because of the cost of that, it's a rarer thing for us to do. If you came a few years ago, you may have seen the installation we had with sound and music that was done in the Switzer Gallery, which was done by a West Virginia artist and his partner, which paired changing lighting and music combined with paintings. And it was really incredible. And it was the first sort of digital inspired kind of exhibition we've done in a long time. And people really loved it. And we'd love to do more. But again, it all comes down to the funding at the museum and finding people who are willing to write checks to bring what tend to be much more expensive shows to install and display. So yeah, we're always open to doing more though, because there's a lot of fun ones out there that would work in our spaces.
Okay, thank you for that feedback. And I will say that the installation that you're mentioning with the light and the sound has been my favorite that the museum has ever had that I've seen at least.
It was not only a great show, but it was one that scared us a lot because it was our first time building out a gallery space and using all of that technology. And originally the costs looked like they were going to be like $60,000 or $70,000, which is just not a level that we can function at for an exhibit. But we were able to work with the artists and get it down to a reasonable enough number where we could actually do it. And it was wonderful. And as I said, we'd love to do more of those, but they tend to be a lot more expensive when you're bringing in from, let's say, another institution who creates a show like that, or you're working with a gallery or an artist on more of an international or national level. It can be, some shows can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, which it just knocks us completely out of the ballpark to do. But yeah, it would be great to have more of those if we can find ones that are affordable.
I'm thankful today to hear you and your philosophy. Back to the painting of Billy Scott, and your reference to how that's the whole, at that particular point in time, and your description of the funny side of racism. I think that I love your philosophy around how we delicately balance the importance of a museum like we have, and how we're so proud of it, that we have to be out in the forefront to touch the whole concern of justice and whatever and that's going on around us in our real lives. And well, that's just powerful.
It really is. And adding this kind of work is really important to us. And I mean, it's what's funny about Huntington and the museum is people think that we either don't have anything good or we wouldn't have anything diverse. But if you look at our collection, we have a 700-piece Near Eastern collection in the middle of Appalachia. Okay, we have an African American collection. We have works by every kind of artist from every kind of background. It's incredibly diverse, and we're constantly looking at that. As I said, we chased trying to get one of Billy Scott's paintings for years and years. And we were just so excited finally recently to make the connection, and that the family was finally willing to release some, because they treasure them, and when you get something that you want to represent it as a treasure, once you have it. And when I talked about, going back here, way back to the beginning, to this slide, the picture of the landscape on the lower right by Richard Lonsdale Brown, we're one of the, I think we may be the only museum in the United States that has a work by him in their permanent collection, because there are only 3 known works. And we in Huntington have one by one of the most important early 20th century African-American artists. It's here. It's not in Washington, D.C. It's not in New York. It's not in Los Angeles. It's not in Chicago. It's not in Dallas. It's here in Huntington. And that's incredible. And what's even more incredible is, he wrote about West Virginia and, being raised here and how much he loved it. And his most fervent thing that he wrote about was that he looked forward to the day that he could leave New York and come back and, quote, paint those West Virginia hills that I love. And he never got to do that. He actually went from New York to Oklahoma, where he died in his early 20s. And in fact, stay right where you are. This is his death certificate. It's sitting on my desk because we've been researching him, trying to find out where did all his art go after he died. And what's even sadder about that? He is buried in an abandoned cemetery in Oklahoma. You can barely enter it. So in Oklahoma, this famous artist, basically you don't even know he's there. Nobody cares to take care of it. I mean, it's really amazing. And those stories are worth telling. So, as I said, I'm very proud that we have that painting in our collection.
Do we have any other questions for Jeff? Well, Jeff, I want to thank you. I've gotten a lot of nice comments. Well done. Look forward to an in-person walkthrough soon. Great presentation. Thank you. Very informative. Wow. I knew you would be great, so I had no doubts. So thank you for this wonderful presentation. And I think our participants, we've had 21 to 22 today, or at one point 23. And thank you for helping us continue our program via Zoom during this kind of unprecedented time in our lives. So thank you so much.
Absolutely, and I'd be happy to do another one. In fact, I'll send it out to you and to your participants.
Oh, we'd love that.
Think about a topic